The Hermer dilemma: how human rights could topple Starmer. Right, let's cut straight through the Westminster waffle, shall we? While everyone's been obsessing over Rachel Reeves' spreadsheets and whether Angela Rayner can tell the difference between a hammer and a housing policy, there's a rather more explosive story brewing in the corridors of power. And it's one that could very well bring down Keir Starmer's government before it's even properly found its feet. The name you need to remember is Lord Hermer. Richard Hermer KC, to give him his full title, currently sits as Attorney General in Starmer's cabinet. Now, you might think the Attorney General is just another legal wonk shuffling papers in Whitehall, but you'd be spectacularly wrong. This man holds the keys to what could become Labour's political apocalypse. Here's the thing about Lord Hermer that should have alarm bells ringing in number 10. He's not just committed to human rights law, he's practically married to it. We're talking about a barrister who spent decades defending the European Convention on Human Rights with a kind of passion most people reserve for their favorite football team. And therein lies a problem for Starmer and his ambitious agenda. You see, while Sir Keir talks a good game about economic growth and levelling up Britain, the harsh reality is that every single one of his policies is about to slam headfirst into the immovable object that is Lord Hermer's legal philosophy. Immigration policy, blocked by human rights concerns. Housing development, stalled by judicial reviews. Economic investment, diverted into legal fees faster than you can say European Court of Human Rights. Now, before you start thinking this is just another tedious constitutional row, consider this. We're potentially witnessing the most significant internal government conflict since the Blair-Brown feuds, except this time it's not about personality clashes or leadership ambitions. This is about fundamental philosophical differences that could paralyze the entire Labour project. The mathematics of this crisis are brutally simple. Every pound that Labour wants to invest in infrastructure, in housing, in the grand economic revival that Starmer promised, risks being swallowed up by the legal machinery that Lord Hermer's approach inevitably triggers. Judicial reviews don't come cheap, and neither do the endless court battles that follow when human rights law collides with practical governance. Take housing, for instance. Angela Rayner can announce all the ambitious building targets she likes, but if every major development project gets tangled up in human rights litigation, those targets become nothing more than expensive campaign promises. The public won't care about the legal complexities. They'll just see another Labour government that promised much and delivered little. And here's where it gets really interesting. The immigration question isn't going away, no matter how much Labour might wish it would. The British public, whether we like it or not, expects results on this issue. But how do you deliver meaningful immigration reform when your own Attorney General views the ECHR as sacred text? It's like trying to perform surgery with your hands tied behind your back. The cool irony is that Starmer, himself a former director of public prosecutions, should understand these dynamics better than most. He's not naive about how legal processes can derail political ambitions. Yet here he is, trapped by his own appointments and his own party's ideological commitments. Lord Hermer isn't some rogue operator. He's doing exactly what Starmer knew he would do when he appointed him. But here's what makes this truly fascinating from a political strategy perspective. There are voices within Labour who are beginning to recognize the scale of this problem. Younger MPs, pragmatic operators who care more about electoral success than legal purity, are starting to ask uncomfortable questions. How long can Labour afford to let principle trump pragmatism? The David Blunkett factor is particularly intriguing here. Blunkett, along with Jack Straw, represents the old Labour guard who understood that successful governance sometimes requires making choices that legal purists find uncomfortable. These are people who actually ran government departments, who know the difference between opposition virtue signaling and the messy realities of power. Their influence within the party, while not what it once was, remains significant. Now, the nuclear option that some are whispering about in Westminster corridors is almost too dramatic to contemplate, forcing Lord Hermer's resignation and initiating withdrawal from the ECHR. It sounds like political fantasy, but consider the logic. If Labour can't deliver on its core promises because of legal constraints, what exactly is the point of being in government? The tactical brilliance of such a move would be undeniable. Suddenly, all those policy areas where Labour has been struggling would become manageable. Housing development accelerates when you're not fighting endless court battles. Immigration policy becomes coherent when you're not constantly looking over your shoulder at Strasbourg. Tax policy becomes more flexible when you're not funding an army of expensive lawyers. Of course, the political risks are enormous. Labor progressive base would be apoplectic. The human rights lobby would declare war. International criticism would be swift and severe. But here's the question that's keeping strategists awake at night. Is the alternative any better? Is it preferable to remain paralyzed by legal processes while the conservative opposition rebuilds and the public loses faith in Labor's competence? The electoral mathematics are particularly stark. Labor won the last election partly by promising competent governance after years of conservative chaos. But competence requires delivery, and delivery requires the ability to implement policy without being constantly second-guessed by the courts. If Labor can't demonstrate that difference in governance style, their electoral coalition becomes vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. The housing crisis alone could sink this government. British voters have been promised solutions to the housing shortage for decades, and they are running out of patience with excuses. If Labor's grand housing plans get bogged down in human rights litigation while homelessness persists and young people can't afford to buy homes, the political consequences will be severe. Immigration remains a third rail of British politics, but it's a rail that Labour can't avoid touching forever. The public expects action, not legal seminars about international obligations. Every hotel filled with asylum seekers while British families struggle with housing costs becomes a political weapon in opposition hands. The optics are devastating, regardless of the legal niceties involved. What makes this situation particularly precarious for Starmer is that he can't claim ignorance. He appointed Lord Hermer knowing exactly what kind of Attorney General he would be. This isn't a case of being blindsided by an unexpected political development. This is a predictable consequence of prioritizing legal idealism over political pragmatism. The economic implications extend far beyond legal fees. Significant though those are, international investors are watching how Britain handles these internal contradictions. If the perception takes hold that the UK government can't implement policy efficiently because of legal obstacles, investment decisions will reflect that reality. The investment-led growth that Labour promised becomes much harder to achieve when the regulatory environment is uncertain and contested. The generational divide within Labour on these issues is particularly significant. Younger Labour politicians, those who came of age during the Blair years or after, often have a different perspective on human rights absolutism than their older colleagues. They've seen how legal processes can be weaponized against progressive policymaking, and they are less emotionally invested in the post-war international legal order. This isn't about being anti-human rights, despite how the debate will inevitably be framed. It's about recognizing that successful governance requires balancing competing priorities, and sometimes making difficult choices. The voters who put Labour in power didn't do so because they wanted a government paralyzed by legal perfectionism. They did so because they wanted effective leadership and tangible improvements in their lives. The 4-year timeline is crucial here. Governments have a limited window to establish their competence and deliver on their promises. If Labour spends the first 2 years of this parliament tied up in legal battles over fundamental policy directions, they'll struggle to make the case for renewal when the next election comes around. The Conservative opposition, meanwhile, will be watching this internal Labour conflict with considerable interest. They understand that the best way to regain power isn't necessarily to attack Labour's policies directly, but to highlight Labour's inability to implement those policies effectively. Every court case, every judicial review, every legal obstacle becomes evidence of Labour's governing incompetence. The irony is that Lord Hermer's unwavering commitment to human rights law, admirable though it may be in principle, could end up undermining the very social progress that human rights are supposed to protect. If his legal absolutism helps bring down a Labour government and ushers in a more right-wing Conservative administration, the long-term consequences for human rights in Britain could be far more severe than any short-term compromises might have been. The pressure points are already becoming visible. Every time a policy announcement is followed immediately by legal challenges, every time a government initiative gets bogged down in judicial review, the narrative of Labour incompetence grows stronger. The British public, fairly or unfairly, doesn't distinguish between legal obstacles and political failures. They just see a government that can't get things done. The resolution of this crisis, one way or another, will define the trajectory of Starmer's premiership. If he can find a way to reconcile his government's policy ambitions with Lord Hermer's legal principles, Labour might survive and even thrive. But if this fundamental tension remains unresolved, it will poison everything Labour tries to achieve and hand their opponents a powerful weapon. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not just talking about the success or failure of individual policies. We're talking about whether democratic governance can function effectively within the constraints of contemporary human rights law. That's a question with implications far beyond Westminster politics. What happens next will be determined by whether pragmatism or principle wins out within Labour's ranks. The answer to that question won't just shape the next few years of British politics. It could define the relationship between law and democracy for a generation. And that, frankly, is a story worth watching very closely indeed. So there you have it, the Hermer dilemma in all its constitutional complexity and political explosiveness. The man appointed to uphold the law might just end up bringing down the government that appointed him. It's almost Shakespearean in its tragic inevitability, except the consequences will be all too real for millions of British citizens waiting for their government to actually govern. Keep your eyes on this space, because what unfolds next could reshape British politics in ways we're only just beginning to understand. If you found this deep dive into the hidden power struggles of Westminster as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, with the way this government is shaping up, there will be plenty more explosive political drama to dissect in the weeks and months ahead. Until next time, this has been UK Connors, and remember, in British politics, it's always the quiet ones you need to watch.